Hey everybody, welcome back to the Prosperous Nonprofit. I'm really excited to be here with you with today. Okay. Normally I can get that sentence out. We're just going to start that one over. See, this is the beauty of editing. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Prosperous Nonprofit. I'm excited to be here today with somebody that I have known for many years at this point, Jailan Adly. Jailan, welcome.
Thanks, Stephanie. It's great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about your role and what you do now.
I'm a managing director at Good Citizen. We are an executive search firm that specializes in the social sector. So we help nonprofits and foundations and social enterprises with their leadership searches, usually VPs and up. Um, and I froze.
That's fine. That's fine. We will take that part out. Man, yeah, Brian's gonna have his work cut out for him
Should
today.
I
It's
start that
fine.
over or did I freeze in time where it can cut?
No, I think he can cut it. It's fine. It's fine. Um, yeah, oh, this is gonna be a funny one. If we did bloopers, it would be like,
Blooper reels.
yeah, exactly. All right, so I will dive us back in. So you really have a broad sense of the nonprofit sector, because if you're the one that is finding the top talent and the leaders of these organizations, you see a lot, I would imagine. So what do you see like sort of happening broadly in the nonprofit sector right now? What challenges are organizations that you're working with? What are they facing?
Yeah, I think we're kind of living in the post-COVID 2020 world, where we're seeing a lot of different organizations face similar challenges. So, everything from really grappling with the work from home and how that has manifested into, what the expectations are even from candidates nowadays. And I think, yeah, a lot of nonprofits and foundations are really struggling to figure out what is that right balance, right? We know that top talent is really looking for that flexibility, but a lot of times, especially those organizations that their work is very place based, there's a sense of wanting staff to be in the place that they're doing the work. So we're working a lot with organizations to help them think through that, as they look to build out their leadership teams in a way that also sets an expectation that makes sense for the entire organization as well. So that's kind of one of the things that we're looking at. And I think also the for US based and also globally, the kind of social reckoning that we went through in 2020, and post that, we're seeing a lot of organizations come and say we need to work on our diversity, equity, inclusion, but they're starting from very different starting lines. And so really working with organizations and boards to understand where they're at and what does it mean to build a diverse team, and then what are the right steps to do that, right? I think there's a tendency to kind of fast forward to, well, if we just hire diverse candidates, we'll be okay. But if the organizations don't actually do the work, oftentimes they're setting candidates of color up for failure, right? It's not an environment where it's necessarily psychologically safe. It's not an environment where they can move things forward. So there's a lot of kind of background work that needs to happen, that isn't just about making sure that your leadership teams are diverse and your staff is diverse, but actually making sure that the scaffolding is there to set those leaders up for success.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. So do you and your team, are you sort of helping an organization assess where they are? Because often, like I'm sure it's like, okay, yeah, we want diverse candidates, but like you said, if the organization doesn't have the right infrastructure in place, that candidate is not going to be successful in their role because possibly it's not safe. So are you helping sort of like assess where they are and maybe pointing them in the direction of resources for them to continue doing that work to set up a safe environment?
Yes, I mean, we're mostly focused on the search. In that process, we do what we call kind of our backgrounding interviews, right? Where we're meeting with different staff. We're kind of doing a 360 of that role. And in those discussions, we're kind of level setting where the organization is at. At times, if it does sound like they might need a little bit more, we'll kind of, provide strong recommendations for them to do some more work, go find a, consultants that can support on that. Sometimes they come to us in their mid-process and, they still need to find that leader. So our role is to be kind of as transparent and as supportive as possible, both to the clients and the candidates, right? We want to be transparent with candidates. We want candidates to know what they're walking into. Some candidates are like, yeah, I'm ready to take that on. I understand that I'll be, the first coming in that's a person of color, and I'll have to kind of do these. And there's some folks who are ready for that, and there's others that are like, you know what, I'm tired. Like that's not what I want to walk into. So we want to have a really realistic view and be, realistic with the client in terms of, here's how the market is going to take this in. Here's how potential candidates will perceive where you're at in your journey. Here's how it's going to land with potential candidates of color. And then at the same time, while yes, the clients are the organizations, we want to make sure at the end of the day, everyone's set up for success. So we try to be, as transparent as possible with the candidates to let them know like where we feel the organization is at and in their journey. So then they can decide, yes, that's a place where I'm able to kind of come in and I have the energy for it, or no, I don't have the energy for that. I'm looking for an organization at a different juncture in their journey.
I think that sort of 360 review you mentioned is so powerful because, I mean, it's in everyone's best interest to make sure that everyone is set up for success. And so I think that doing that work on the front end, is going to help that, it's going to help that, that end game. One thing that I have seen is a real challenge around finding and retaining talent when resources are so tight, and when in a lot of cases, I know you're recruiting mostly on the leadership side of things, but when many staff members in organizations are not paid a living wage, and so you're probably at the at the higher end of things because you are recruiting for leaders. But what have you seen in terms of salaries and the discrepancy between what candidates, what their value is and what they really should be paid versus what an organization has the budget for, has the resources for it, and or is willing to pay?
Yeah, I think this is the big social sector conundrum, right? And I think it leads to the larger question of the financing even of nonprofits. When, as someone who came from the nonprofit sector, always knowing that foundation salaries were higher, now seeing that, right, because we're working with foundations and nonprofits, there's a massive discrepancy there oftentimes. And so, I think there's a conversation and a discussion that needs to be had sector wide, right? Where the folks who are arguably dealing with the most stress because they're on the ground doing the work are yet nowhere near as paid as those deciding who gets the funding because of where the money is held and kept. I think we're seeing conversations and a push for more unrestricted funded, for funding that, I think, back in the day it was, we're only covering programs and we're not, covering staff, which you would never hear of in the private sector, right? You can't create a product if you don't have staff, just like you can't run programs if you don't have staff. And if you want programs that are actually going to create real impact, which means breaking cycles of dependency and breaking these systemic barriers, you're going to want your top talent, and your top talent needs to be paid what they would get in any other sector. And so, and I think also, as we're seeing the flex of skills and the transferability between the private sector and the social sector and the public sector, people aren't necessarily getting pigeonholed. So, the private sector can come and offer them a lot more benefits and a lot more salary for their own families. And I think especially when we're talking about candidates of color who are not just trying to create wealth for themselves, but generational wealth, because they don't have that coming in, right? And so they're trying to set up their families for success. Those are actually really important things that they have to consider. Yes, they want to do good for our community. Yes, we all want to do that. But at the same time, there's all these other things that they have to factor in, including, their living and their families. And so I think there's and it's a candidate market right now, just, there's been a push for that. And so salary has been a real sticking point for organizations that aren't necessarily able to come up to where the rest of the market is, or meet the rest of the market. So we're seeing some come up and some kind of trying to stay, and that's caused some tensions in terms of the quality and the types of candidate they can get, and frankly, the diversity of the pool that they can get as well.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I've seen this in so many organizations, even in, my own organization, and it's just seeming like now, the flexibility piece and the cause is like not enough anymore. It's, you need that sort of trifecta between like my work life flexibility and the purpose, the cause, the mission, and the money. Like it used to be, I feel like it used to be where, the cause and the flexibility was enough, and we could kind of get by with paying significantly lower, but like that's not enough anymore. And I think that's interesting, your point about how there's more fluidity between the corporate sector and the nonprofit sector, and so people can kind of shift between, and like we just can't compete with corporate salaries and corporate benefits. And I was actually just on an interview right before this with a foundation employee, and he is really a champion of unrestricted funding, of, providing organizations the infrastructure and capacity building support that they need. But I think that's like a little bit of an anomaly. Like I think he's a unicorn, and I'm not seeing that a lot. So yeah, I think that's a huge challenge. So those organizations that you're working with that are winning, that are able to, provide a safe and successful environment for their new leaders coming in, what are they doing differently? Like what's working?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know if there's a silver bullet answer. I think having really strong donors who are partners is really important, because they're like investors, right? And I think I've always talked about donors as investors, because I think it's the same that you would in the private sector, right? An investor wants your business to succeed, an investor wants your organization to succeed, right? And so if we kind of flip that script and think of them as investors, and they think of themselves as that, they're going to be there through the rough patches, right? When COVID hit, organizations with really strong relationships with donors were able to go and say, hey, we need resources to kind of get us through this. So I think, those strong relationships are key. And then a really balanced board. I think the board of directors plays a really interesting function in the nonprofit world, because everybody's a volunteer and there's not necessarily monetary incentive. And so you're asking people to put in a lot of effort, and they're not getting necessarily paid for it. And then there's the other issue of, they're also usually wanting to, or being asked to donate, right? So you're actually giving money and you're volunteering your time, right? So it's this interesting dynamic where then, sometimes you're creating a board that's a fully fundraising board, but they aren't necessarily from the sector or understand the situation at hand. Or sometimes you have a heavy working board where they all come from the sector, but they don't necessarily have the funds to give to you. And if any of those get lopsided, it can get really hard for the leaders of the organization, especially the ED or the CEO, to kind of move things forward. And so really creating a balanced board where you have all those perspectives represented, and there's a real kind of, working relationship between not just the CEO and the board, because oftentimes there's like gatekeeping that happens. The board really needs to understand what's going on at the organization writ large, especially if you have, CEO founders that have been there for a long time. Oftentimes we're coming and, it's time to place a new CEO and it's a founder transition, and the founder's been around for, 15, 25 years. And, the staff don't feel that the board has a real pulse at all as to what's going on. And you'll talk to the staff and the board in terms of, what do they think they need in a leader? And it's completely different. And so it's the boards who have a pulse further than just the CEO or the ED, who make the time to understand, the work, who meet with the staff, and keep that grounded, are the ones who are able to then be ready to do one of the most important things that a board does, which is hire an ED or a CEO for an organization, right? They are responsible for that in the same way that they've got fiduciary responsibility. But if they're just kind of tuning in when it's time to bring that person on, then it's really hard to actually place someone that the staff is going to be bought into and excited about.
That's such a great point, because I've seen organizations where, the CEO is the only person that has a relationship with the board, and it's almost like forbidden to even talk to them, not in like a, like hiding things, but it was just like, these people are like the almighty powerful board. Do not talk to them. Do not bother them. Like, they are my thing. And then I've seen other organizations where, each leader of each department presents to the board, and there's a relationship and there's conversations. And so the board is so much more informed. And I would imagine, like you said, like the quality of leaders that the board can hire when they understand what the organization actually truly needs is, like, I would imagine that's a big difference. One thing I've been thinking about and kind of talking about and working on lately is thinking about the CFO of an organization and the relationship that the CFO and the CEO have together. And so I wonder, have you done any projects working on recruiting for CFOs of organizations lately? And what qualities are you looking for in a CFO these days?
Yeah. So I think CFO roles are interesting, right? Because there are some very specific nuances that, nonprofit finances, as you know, when we worked together, it was because you had that nuance, right? You understood the unrestricted versus restricted funds. Someone coming from the private sector will kind of look at that, scratch their head and be like, what are we talking about? But all of those things they're nuanced in that someone who's been a CFO at a nonprofit will be able to slide in fairly easy. However, the principles, are fairly transferable, where you could potentially get a CFO from the private sector or the public sector. I think the CFO role is actually one of the harder ones to do if the salary doesn't match the rest of the market, because there's super transferable skills. And so if you can be a CFO of a nonprofit, you can jump to the private sector. So that's one of the rules where if that salary isn't right sized, it's really hard to find a top-notch CFO that'll stay for a long time, right? And that doesn't get poached to go somewhere else. And I think that's one of the roles you want to keep longevity with, right? They really want to be a partner to the CEO, because it isn't just about, balancing the books and making sure that, everything is accounted for. As a nonprofit where finances and resources are somewhat scarce, you want a CFO who's also strategic, who can start to think about, as you and your program team start to think of, okay, what are income generating opportunities we can do? What are other ways that we can generate income outside of just, donations or grants? Or we're putting in this giant proposal for the US government. We have to meet all of these compliance requirements. Are we here? You really need a partner in that CFO who can think larger than the numbers and think towards the future and help you put that plan in place. And so, out of all the positions there's kind of three positions to really invest in, where we find that organizations that invest the salary, the benefits, the support systems in those roles, you get your kind of strong trifecta, which is obviously the CEO, ED, the CFO, and then your chief development officer, who's bringing in the funds. Who in the private sector would be your salesperson, right? And your salesperson's usually your top billed person in the private sector. For some reason, they're not in the nonprofit sector, and they're the fastest to burn out and the fastest to turn over. So we really see, those three critical roles, organizations who understand the value of those three roles and create the profile and the jobs descriptions for that in a way that matches that, are really the ones that succeed.
Yeah. That's so, yeah, I mean, you're totally right. It's thinking about like the chief development person. I do feel like there is so much pressure put on that role. It's like, okay, welcome to this new organization. By the way, now you need to raise $10 million. Good luck. It's a lot. Oh my gosh, it's so much. As you're bringing in each of these three key roles, and I think I would agree with you that those are like the most critical, and the ones where you don't want somebody to pop in for a year and then have to, and then leave and have to fill that role again. How do you see like those three roles working together? And as you're looking to fill those positions, how are you assessing like how a leadership team of those three roles and maybe some others like interact with each other? Because I'm asking because I've seen the CFO role and the development, like the head development person or that lead fundraising person, really operate in silos, and that obviously doesn't really work very well. You need each other. But then I've seen other organizations having it work really well where they're working so closely together. So how are you sort of assessing and helping set that relationship up for success?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in our role as, as a search firm, we're trying to find the right candidate based on not just qualifications we need, but the team. So oftentimes, we're looking for one role, and we now have met the other folks that are on the senior leadership team in those 360 interviews that we do. So we get a sense of, what are the skills already on the team? What are the different personalities? What are the leadership styles? Some of the questions we ask is, what's actually missing from your leadership team, right? From a leadership style perspective, as well. So not just kind of the skill set, but kind of the thinking, right? Sometimes we'll get, answers like, we've got a lot of doers and we're missing the visionary, or we have a bunch of visionaries. We actually need someone who's going to, come in and like help us drive forward. So it's kind of, we have to work within the confines of the search that we're working on. But part of the, bringing a diverse pool forward, we like to, as much as possible, not just bring diversity from the perspective of, who those candidates are and their lived experience and all of that, but also their styles, so that they get a chance to kind of see different scenarios, right? Like, what would this style bring to our leadership team versus this one? And what's complementary? What will push us? What will, all of those types of questions. And then as the client starts to narrow down from that pool to the person that they select, helping kind of guide and advise and remind, right? So that they're kind of thinking of those things, right? So as we're doing the debriefs, talking through, yes, they have these really strong qualifications in X, Y, and Z, but how do you think that will be from a leadership team? Do you feel like they're going to gel well with the team? Are they filling a need that you said that you really needed in terms of bringing that visionary perspective? So those are the types of things that we're constantly kind of helping guide and advise clients as we're going through a search process.
Yeah, I like that, especially the part that resonated with me about like, okay, we have a bunch of visionaries. We need somebody who can actually like create a plan and see something like through the execution, or vice versa. I think that's huge. And that's something that I know I've even looked for and thought about as I've brought people onto my team. And I feel like sometimes we're not thinking that strategically in the nonprofit sector, maybe not so much with leadership positions, but thinking about how listeners can apply this to hiring in their organization. Yeah, maybe you're not hiring a CEO or executive director, maybe you're hiring, a program officer, but thinking about how their skill set and their soft skills will contribute to the team. Like I knew I needed a sort of right-hand person on my team that's a doer, that is actually going to get into the details, because I'm more like, I want to think about the ideas and I don't really want to get into like, the details. And so I just thinking about that for anybody listening, how to balance your team, even if you're not hiring for leadership positions, but people within the organization. I would imagine that like that same idea applies, right? Like you don't have to be just thinking about your leadership roles. You can use that same idea and really everything you've said today, of really making sure you're setting the person up for success and things like that when you're recruiting anybody in the organization, not just leaders.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What type of like sort of technology or data related experience or qualities are you looking for when you're filling some of these leadership roles, and not necessarily like specific software, because that would vary based on the role, but are you what sort of level of proficiency or interest even are you looking for when it comes to like using data and KPIs and that kind of thing for managing an organization?
Yeah, I think that has really depended on the level of sophistication the organization is at. We're seeing overall a general movement towards more sophistication on the tech front, and tech front being like, being able to use big data, being able to monitor in real time. So are we collecting data analytics in real time so that we can make real time decisions? Different organizations are at very different places in their journey as to, where they are, but the trend is moving towards more technologically advanced on that front. And so, in terms of what we're looking for, really again depends on where that organization is. Some of the organizations we work with are very tech forward, and so those are skills that are kind of non-negotiable. And then there's other organizations where it's a nice to have. And so one of the things that we do when we're getting ready to launch a search is we create kind of a custom assessment, right, rubric, where we kind of outline, here are the skills in the background we're looking for, what's negotiable, what's a nice to have. I think oftentimes, organizations go into, we all do this, right? We're kind of trying to find a unicorn. Well, sometimes they're out there, sometimes they're not. And so we want to kind of understand like what are the priorities that we're looking for, and then kind of go from there. Ideally, this person has all of the qualifications we're looking for, but if their area of genius, right, is in a few, making sure that area of genius and what is needed is the part that overlaps the most in that kind of Venn diagram.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. And I've worked with some organizations who like everything that they own is in an Excel spreadsheet, and others who are using much more sophisticated ways to capture and measure their data. But I know from like the finance side of things, we are trying to bring more KPIs and more financial metrics to our clients so that they can use that information to help them measure where they are, where they want to be, and their goals and whatnot. All right, so I think I have just two more questions for you. My first is, what advice would you give to job seekers in the nonprofit sector right now?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Very broad question.
I would say really narrowing, because I think sometimes we see folks who are interested in doing work in the nonprofit sector. Scratch that.
Okay.
All right. So, the advice I would give candidates in the nonprofit sector, and frankly, in any sector, is get really clear on not just the issue areas you want to work in, but the function area that you want to work in as well, right? Do you want to lean in and going into development, right? What does that mean to be the fundraiser? There's different branches you can go. You can be a major gifts officer. You can be a proposal writer. Do you want to go into the finance or the operations and the program side? There's a whole plethora of things that you can go into on the program side. If you want to, if you're on the foundation or you want to transition in the foundation world, being able to bring that, showcase your analytical skills, your ability to do research, your ability to see big partnerships and big systems and bring that together, and then articulate that in your resume. There's a debate out there about cover letters. We're still trying to find the best thing, especially with ChatGPT out there. Cover letters are kind of easy to write, but taking the time to really make sure that you are providing the selection committee, the recruiter, the hiring manager, enough of an insight from whatever you want to call that top page, right? That makes something more personalized jump out from just your resume. You want your resume to be pretty crisp and clear and succinct. And then, your value statement, your mission statement, your cover letter, whatever that is, to really kind of jump out on the personal side and link to the position description. So really read your position, whatever you're applying to. We get this all the time where we're pretty clear as to what the characteristics are, and then we'll get someone just coming out from left field and hasn't tied. They might see it in their mind that there's a translation there, but they haven't done the work of tying that in the application. So really going through and saying, okay, I hear and I'm seeing that this is what you're looking for. Here's what I have done demonstrates that I can do X, Y, and Z. That tie is what's going to bring you to the top.
I think that's so powerful, and I totally agree. And I feel like when people are doing the former, where they're just dropping this basic cover letter that's really not related at all, it's they're doing the, the spray and pray method, where it's let's just apply to everything and hope somebody grabs me. But I feel like being much more strategic in your search and actually putting some time into the positions that are really and truly a good fit, I feel like it's more than just a numbers game. And I feel like people are kind of treating it like a numbers game, but if you're more strategic and focused on your search, you're going to win, versus just applying to literally everything. I don't know if you agree. I feel like that's how I've done it before, is being more strategic and focused and putting that extra time into things that I think would actually be a good fit versus trying to play a numbers game.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking for a job is exhausting and it's stressful and it's tiring, and we get that. I think the advantage of, using a search firm is we are able to provide way more support to potential candidates. And granted, again, we're looking at the executive levels, right? It would be cost prohibitive to do it for every single role that you have. Hopefully you have a team that can do some of this, but as a search firm, we try to answer potential candidate questions before they apply, so that we're not necessarily wasting their time, and so that they know ahead of time, this isn't necessarily the right position. So we try to do that as much as possible. At least at Good Citizen, that's one of the things that we heavily focus on, is making the time as much as we can, given we're working on a lot of things, to potential candidates, so that they're not wasting their time if it's not a good fit. And also being transparent, right? When we have conversations and saying, I'm not sure if this is necessarily aligned, feel free to throw your hat in, but based on what we're hearing from the client, this might not necessarily be the right alignment. But yeah, for those that aren't going through, if a role's not going using a search firm, then I think being strategic and really, you're gonna spend more time on that potential application But that time you spend on that is going to get you further than that same amount of time kind of, doing that spray approach, right? Where you're just kind of
Yeah.
putting it apart,
Yes.
and no one's going to call you because you haven't made that tie at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's huge. That is huge. And are you seeing, it's interesting that you mentioned Chat GPT because I've definitely had several conversations with people in the sector about using Chat GPT like for grant proposals, for example. Is it clear to you when somebody has used an AI tool for their cover letter or not necessarily?
You could usually tell, but not necessarily. And honestly, if you're smart about using it, I mean, I have definitely told people check it out for grant proposal writing.
Yeah.
It's an interesting tool to write proposals. It's an interesting tool to write communications pieces and emails if you know how to prompt it to actually have your voice. So I'm not gonna,
Yes.
so I don't, I think if you are just feeding it something and it's spitting out and you're just using that, then that has, there's no strategy there. If you're using it to help wordsmith a little bit and like fix a sentence that you want to make a bigger impression with, then, to each their own. Can
Yeah.
we tell when something has just been, kind of copy pasted? Yes, you can absolutely tell when something's been copy pasted. Are there others that are probably using it, in a strategic and smart way and we're not noticing? Yeah, most likely.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, when I've asked it, I've definitely used it for lots of different things, just kind of testing it out. And the exact text that it spits out for certain things, I'm like, yeah, I would never say anything like this. So maybe I can use the ideas and then shape it, sort of shape it into my own. But, using it for an outline, I've definitely done that before. And it's so helpful because it's like, oh yeah, I had all these ideas, but now it's organized it nicely for me. And now I can use this to then help me write the piece or whatever. So that's interesting. Okay, don't use Chat GPT and like use it word for word and just pop it into a cover letter because you can probably tell. So that's a good tip to our listeners. All right. Well, my last question for you today, Jailan, is what does a prosperous nonprofit look like to you?
Hmm. Um, I think that a prosperous nonprofit is one that ultimately the participants, the people, the communities that they are trying to support find that nonprofit, scratch it, we're going to start that over,
Okay.
rethink this.
What does a prosperous nonprofit look like to you?
So I think for me, a prosperous nonprofit is one that has its eye on the ultimate outcome of the impact, depending on what the goal is. If your goal is alleviating poverty or solving a climate crisis or one of those, then a prosperous nonprofit should be actually working itself out of a job and
Mhm.
out of cycles of dependency and having
Mhm.
the vision to do that, right? Because as soon as nonprofits usually are coming from a scarcity model to begin with. And then from that, you're building a scarcity future, right? And so prosperity is, yes, a prosperous nonprofit is one that has the funding it needs to do its work, the support and the investors it needs to do its work. It's a joyous place to work. It's showing that it's making massive impact. The beneficiaries, the participants, the communities that it serves are you see tangible changes there. But ultimately, if the problem really is being solved, then it should be finding a way to gracefully sunset. And those are for specific nonprofits, right? If you're an arts nonprofit, education, it's a little bit different, but kind of, the world that I come from working in global development, most of the things we were trying to solve ideally would be solved, right? And we should be working
Mhm.
ourselves out of a job.
Mm-hmm. I love that so much because that's something I often say about my role and my company as a fractional finance team is like we would like to work ourselves out of a job so that we've built capacity internally for an organization to grow to the point to be able to hire somebody full time internally. And so I think from a broader perspective, I love that versus this, like you said, sort of cycle of dependency. And I think that there's such vision that needs to come with that thought about working ourselves out of a job. And there's like, removing this. Oh my gosh, there's like so many directions we could go with this, but just thinking about like removing the sort of ego and the like, I'm such a hero for like working on this big problem. And removing that from the equation, I think is just, yeah, that's a whole other direction that we could go. But yeah, I love that definition of a prosperous nonprofit. And every single time I ask this question, I get a completely different answer from everybody. And so I haven't gotten that answer before about sort of a prosperous nonprofit being one that's focused on working themselves out of business.
And
That's so
I
good.
think it ties well to what you said in that, as we're talking about proximate leadership and decolonizing philanthropy and decolonizing the nonprofit sector, that in and of itself moves away from that savior hero complex, right? Because if you are actually bringing in proximate leadership, the solutions that they will bring are going to be community centric and solution focused, because the lens of which they're looking at the problem doesn't come from this, I have this one great idea and it's special and I'm the hero and I'm gonna, save this. That meant when you're coming from that hero savior mentality, it is always, even in the best of intentions, setting up a dynamic where there's a sense of, unless I'm here or this entity is here, this isn't going to work, right? And when you shift the mindset, and by shifting your leadership and bringing leadership that is proximate to the problem, that has lived experience with it, it is going to be far more solutions oriented and solution centric than when you're kind of parachuting in a solution. So I think those two things kind of go hand in hand. And we're seeing a lot of talk about proximate leadership and decolonizing the sector. We're seeing some action, but I would say we're not quite there yet.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh. Okay. Can we record another episode all about this? Yes. And, I think we work in similar spaces, in terms of global development. And I think we've, probably seen some good examples of this and some not so good examples of this. And so I think it's a conversation that needs to continue to be had, and we can leave it at that for today. But oh my gosh, yes, exactly. So good. This was incredible. And I think just super enlightening to hear things from your perspective as somebody that is helping to, staff the leaders of the nonprofit sector right now. So if organizations want to learn more about the work that you do at your company, where can they find out more?
Yeah, they can visit us on our website, which is www.goodcitizen.com. And you can also follow us on LinkedIn. Both, organizations that are looking for search professionals, we're happy to speak with you, and prospective candidates. All the positions that we work for a variety of clients are on our website as well as our LinkedIn.
Awesome. Awesome. Goodcitizen.com. Everybody definitely check that out. Well, this was such a great conversation. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for being here, Jailan.
For taking the time. I really appreciate it.